let's shift gear a bit. And do a very small medical talk. My name is Steven Weekx. I'm a clinical biologist at the GZA hospitals. And together with the ZNA hospitals in Antwerp, we form one hospital network in the Antwerp region. And this is the locations of our hospitals, of our general hospitals and focus clinics and ambulatory centers. And I have an overlay of the traffic map in Antwerp. And as you can see, there is a lot of red lines. Just like today, there was a lot of traffic in Antwerp. So when we have to transport medical samples from one side to the other, this will be impacted by the traffic jam. So we were very glad, Michael, when you proposed to work together to have some validation, medical validation for transporting samples using drone transport. So this is the study protocol. We had 6 flights. And during each flight, we had some blood tubes drawn from 6 volunteers, in total 35 mils. All these samples were put in the LIS, the lab information system, and then the samples were divided equally. One part of the sample stayed on the ground, the other part was put in the yellow tubings that was hung under the drones, and then after the drone flight, all samples were recollected and analyzed in the lab. These are the 6 flights. It was 2 years ago already that we had our first flight, but due to the COVID pandemic, of course, it took a bit longer than expected. Each flight took 30 minutes. It was hovering above the hospital area. But it's equivalent with 30 kilometers of flight, I think. We had during each flight 3 takeoffs and 3 landings. We asked the pilot to shake the drone very much to have the worst case scenario, of course, with our blood tubes. And we had a continuous temperature monitoring. And this is the rooftop of one of our hospitals where we had the landing platform. So the first thing we looked at was the presence or absence of signs of leakage, of tubing damage, or presence of air bubbles, but we didn't see any effects whatsoever in the tubes that were flown in the drone. The next one is an important one, the hemolysis. And as you might know, hemolysis is the fact that red blood cells are destroyed due to shaking and vibrations and so on, something we don't want, of course, in our tubes. So we looked at the content or the release of the red blood cells content. For example, we looked at potassium, LDH, which is an enzyme, hemoglobin, and this was an indication whether or not there was some hemolysis going on. And these are the results. We had 3 points, H-index, potassium, and LDH. And as you can see, the p-value was above 0.05. And as you might remember from your statistical courses, when it is above 0.05, it's not significant difference. So we did not see a significant difference between the samples that stay on the ground and were flown into the drone, which is, of course, very good for us. There was one sample, however, that had a slight rise of the H-index going from 9 to 33, where the cutoff is 15, but 33 is not very high, because the effects of the free hemoglobin starts at around H-indexes of 250, 500 and higher. So 33 is not really high, but there was a slightly increase, only in one sample out of 36. And the result of this slight increase of H-index was a slight increase of LDH, the other enzyme that was released from the red blood cells. But that was only a minor increase and only in one sample. Next, we looked at the blood grouping, and as might be anticipated, there was no difference, of course, when typing the blood groups between the flight and no-flight samples. So we looked at the ABO, rhesus D, rhesus subgroups, and KEL typing, which are all different blood groups on red blood cells, but no difference whatsoever. Sorry. Next, the more large study was the 40 parameters, hematological and biochemistry parameters. And there we found 4 parameters which were statistically different between both groups. So we looked a bit deeper into that. For example, thrombocytes are platelets, blood platelets. We saw that the p-value was less than 0.05, so statistically different. And when we looked at the results, I'm not sure that you can read those figures on the left-hand side, but there was a 1.5% difference between the samples that stayed on the ground and were flown in the drone. 1.5%, significant, but the question is always, is it clinically relevant? And that's something you have to bear in mind, that not all statistically significant differences are medical or clinically relevant. Why is that? Well, we have a concept what we call biological variation. It could take some hours to explain all that, but imagine that I take blood from all of you and I measure the hemoglobin value. We will all have a different value of hemoglobin, although we are all healthy. The same goes when I take blood from Michael during 30 days and I measure each day your hemoglobin. It will have slightly differences each day, but you are healthy. So this is the concept of biological variation, and we have some within and between biological variations, and these variations are very natural and very normal. And using these variations, which are known in literature, and doing some higher mathematics, we can set a set of criteria to see whether or not 2 measurements are clinically different from each other. So we can compare these 2 sets of samples, one on the ground, one flown under the drone. Are they different or not, medically speaking? We have 2 criteria that we used: the total allowable error, TEA, and reference change value. And I'm not sure that you can read this, but out of the 40 parameters, there were 4 parameters which had a bit increase of the TEA min. So there was some clinically relevant difference looking at the TEA min. However, when we looked at the second criterion, the RCV, also based on these biological variations, we saw no differences. So the difference that we saw were very tight, very low, and I don't think it's clinically relevant, because looking at the other criterion, no difference was seen. The next thing we did was some molecular diagnostic tests. So we took some DNA from Neisseria, a bacteria. We put it in normal urine. We flew it with a drone. When it came back, we searched for the DNA of these Neisseria bacteria, and we found in all samples the DNA, so no problem whatsoever on that. So in conclusion, bear in mind that when you see statistically differences, they're not always clinically relevant. Our study showed no effects on sample integrity, minor hemolytical effects, as I told you, less than 5% in one sample, no effects on blood grouping, no effects on the DNA bacteria that we try to find with using molecular tests, no effects on the majority of our parameters, but there was a limited effect using one criterion, but not using the other criterion, on some biochemical parameters, sodium, potassium, and calcium, more specific. And this is more or less concordant with other publications that we found. So finally, and to conclude, transportation of clinical samples in our point of view is very promising, and I'm looking forward to the future and what will bring this system to us. If you have any questions, please, I'm at the booth, so I will be happy to address them. Thank you.
Thank you very much.